Over the past several days, attention has focused on court activity connected to Blake Lively and filings associated with an ongoing legal dispute. Coverage has pointed to documents and private messages that recently became easier to review, often described as a significant moment in how the case is being discussed. One strand of that discussion has centered on Blake Lively in connection with references to her husband, Ryan Reynolds. Mentions of Ryan Reynolds appear through how filings and correspondence were attributed and grouped within the court record. Those references have been used in coverage to frame the situation relationally, even though they arise from procedural steps rather than new submissions. A separate layer of attention has involved Taylor Swift, whose name surfaced in media discussion as materials circulated more widely. That aspect of coverage has focused on how the texts were described once they became public, with some commentary characterizing the reaction as unexpected or disturbing. These descriptions reflect response and amplification, not a change in how the materials entered the record. Justin Baldoni appears in the case through earlier filings and testimony that form part of the same legal process. References connected to him are tied to motions and court submissions already on file, which later became easier to examine together after access changed. This video follows the sequence behind those developments. Rather than assuming intent or outcome, it traces how materials moved through the court system, how they were preserved in filings, and how visibility later shifted. Understanding that order helps explain why attention increased without suggesting that the underlying position of the case itself changed. The discussion begins with the materials themselves. Much of the attention has focused on text messages and related private communications connected to filings involving Blake Lively and the broader legal dispute. These materials include texts, private messages, and screenshots that were referenced across submissions and later circulated more widely once access changed. In coverage, these materials have often been referred to as leaked texts or described as having been made public in a sudden way. Procedurally, however, they entered the court system through standard channels. Text messages and screenshots tied to Blake Lively were preserved as part of evidence connected to filings, where they were cataloged and maintained alongside other records involving Justin Baldoni. Some of the material involved screenshots of texts taken from phone data. Commentary has described portions of that data as improperly handled or transferred, language that reflects reaction rather than a determination made within the legal process itself. What matters procedurally is that the screenshots and related material were included as part of submissions already on file, not introduced for the first time at the moment they became visible. Private messages referenced in the filings span multiple points in time and involve correspondence attributed across different parties. They were not collected all at once, nor were they presented as a single package. Instead, they appeared across different documents, attached to motions or referenced within testimony involving Justin Baldoni, which is why the same texts can appear to resurface when reviewed in different procedural contexts. As these materials circulated beyond the court record, coverage emphasized their content more than their placement. Some reports framed the messages as disturbing, a characterization tied to reaction rather than process. From a procedural standpoint, the focus remains on how the texts were submitted, preserved, and referenced, not on how they were described after becoming easier to access. References to Ryan Reynolds appear indirectly through how certain filings were attributed and grouped, rather than through separate submissions of new material. This distinction helps explain why attention increased around familiar names without signaling that the underlying materials themselves had changed. Understanding this distinction matters because it explains why attention intensified without indicating a shift in the record. The texts, screenshots, and private messages involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni were already part of the case. What shifted was how easily they could be reviewed together, prompting renewed discussion that extended beyond the filings themselves. This sets up the next step in the sequence: how these materials were gathered and formally introduced through testimony and deposition, which determined how they would be treated within the court record going forward. Once materials like text messages and private communications are identified, the next procedural step concerns how they formally enter the case. In this situation, that step involved deposition and testimony connected to filings already underway. Depositions are designed to preserve statements under defined conditions, allowing materials to be referenced, attached, or discussed within a controlled legal setting. In this case, references tied to Justin Baldoni appear through deposition testimony that addressed earlier communications and related evidence. That testimony did not introduce new material in isolation. Instead, it provided context for items that had already been gathered and documented as part of the legal process. This distinction matters because it explains why attention later focused on testimony without signaling a sudden procedural shift. Mentions of Blake Lively appear through how testimony was attributed and how materials were referenced within filings. When text messages or screenshots are discussed during deposition, they are not treated as standalone revelations. They are tied back to documents already submitted, ensuring that testimony and evidence remain connected within the same record. Coverage has sometimes framed this stage as dramatic, with commentary suggesting that testimony marked a turning point. Procedurally, however, depositions function as a method of clarification rather than escalation. Testimony allows parties to explain how materials relate to claims already on file, not to expand the scope of the case on their own. The role of Reynolds appears indirectly at this stage. References connected to him arise through attribution within testimony or through how documents were grouped in filings, rather than through separate depositions introducing new claims. This reinforces the pattern seen earlier, where familiar names resurface due to document organization rather than new procedural action. Understanding how deposition testimony works helps explain why certain materials gained renewed attention once filings were reviewed together. The testimony preserved statements about texts and communications that were already part of the case. When access later changed, those preserved references became easier to follow in sequence, giving the impression of new development. This leads into the next phase of the process, where testimony and supporting materials are organized within motions and grouped for review. That step determines how the court evaluates what has been submitted, setting the stage for decisions tied to filings rather than reactions to coverage. After testimony preserves how materials are discussed, the next procedural step involves how those materials are organized for review. This happens through court filings and motions, which determine how evidence and testimony are grouped within the record. Rather than appearing randomly, documents move through defined stages that shape how they are evaluated. In this case, filings referencing text messages and related materials were submitted as part of motions tied to the broader dispute. These filings did not create new content. Instead, they assembled previously referenced items, including testimony and exhibits, into a structured format for the court to consider. This is a routine step in litigation and plays a central role in how cases progress. One type of motion that appears in the record is summary judgment. Motions for summary judgment are designed to argue that certain issues can be resolved based on the existing record, without the need for further proceedings on those points. When materials such as deposition testimony or text messages are included in these filings, they are presented as support for arguments already being made, not as independent revelations. References connected to Reynolds appear at this stage through how documents are attributed and grouped within filings. His name surfaces in relation to correspondence or materials cited in motions, rather than through separate filings introducing new evidence. This reinforces a pattern seen earlier, where familiar names reappear because of how the record is assembled, not because of new procedural action. Coverage has sometimes framed the filing of motions as a decisive moment. Procedurally, however, filings serve as organizational tools. They bring together materials that were already part of the case and present them in a way that allows the court to assess their relevance. The motion itself does not change what exists in the record. It changes how that record is presented for review. The same applies to references involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. Their names appear within filings because the materials being discussed are tied to claims and defenses already on file. When filings are read together, it can feel as though information has surfaced all at once. In reality, the documents reflect a cumulative process that unfolded over time. Understanding this grouping step helps explain why attention increased when filings became easier to examine. Once testimony, exhibits, and supporting materials are assembled within motions, the sequence becomes clearer to outside observers. That clarity can create the impression of escalation, even though the procedural posture remains consistent.
Once filings and motions are assembled, the next procedural question centers on access. Not all documents submitted to a court are immediately available for public review. Some materials are designated as sealed, meaning access is restricted while the case progresses. Others may later become unsealed, changing how easily they can be examined together. In this case, certain filings connected to Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni were initially sealed. That status did not remove the documents from the record. It limited who could view them and under what conditions. Sealing is a common procedural step, often used to manage sensitive material while arguments are still being presented. Access changed when some of those filings were unsealed. This shift allowed documents that had already been reviewed by the court to be viewed more broadly. Importantly, unsealing does not introduce new material. It alters visibility, not substance. The documents that became accessible were the same filings and exhibits that had been part of the case earlier. Coverage has sometimes framed this moment as controversial, with commentary treating the change in access as a turning point. Procedurally, however, the unsealing followed a ruling by a judge addressing whether continued restriction was necessary. The ruling focused on access, not on re-evaluating the contents of the filings themselves. References to Reynolds appear within this context through how documents were grouped and attributed once access expanded. When multiple filings are reviewed together, familiar names can stand out more clearly, contributing to the perception that something new has surfaced. In reality, the materials were already part of the record. They were simply easier to examine side by side. Understanding the difference between sealed and unsealed status helps explain why discussion intensified without signaling a shift in the case's underlying position. The ruling that adjusted access did not change what had been submitted or how it would be considered. It changed who could review it and when. This distinction is central to separating process from reaction. When access expands, interpretation often follows. That reaction can be framed as a scandal in coverage, even though the procedural steps remain routine. Recognizing that difference sets the stage for examining how media attention builds once documents are available, which is the focus of the next segment.
Once access to filings expanded, attention moved beyond the court record and into broader media coverage. At that stage, discussion began to focus not only on the existence of documents, but on how specific portions were described once they circulated more widely. This is where references to Taylor Swift entered the conversation. Taylor Swift's name appeared in coverage because text messages attributed to her were discussed as part of the materials being reviewed. These messages were not new filings, nor were they introduced through separate testimony. Instead, they were referenced within documents already tied to the case, which became easier to examine after access changed. Media reports highlighted these texts as disturbing, a description reflecting reaction rather than procedural significance. The emphasis placed on Taylor Swift's involvement came from how the messages were framed once they circulated publicly, not from any change in the legal posture of the case. Her role in the discussion is tied to visibility and amplification, not to filings or motions. Coverage framed the circulation of these messages as unexpected, with headlines and articles focusing on their content rather than their placement in the record. This shift in focus contributed to a broader backlash, as attention moved from procedural steps to interpretation. The reaction was driven by how the texts were described, not by how they entered the legal process. It is important to note that Taylor Swift does not appear as a party to the case, nor as a participant in filings or testimony. Her name surfaces in discussion because the messages attributed to her were included among materials reviewed together once access expanded. This distinction explains why her presence intensified attention without altering the underlying structure of the dispute. The resulting impact illustrates how media coverage can reshape perception once documents become easier to review. The focus on Taylor Swift's texts amplified interest and reaction, even though the procedural status of the case remained unchanged. Understanding that difference helps separate what drove attention from what actually moved the case forward. This pattern sets up the final stage of the sequence: how industry context and institutional names appear alongside these discussions, and how the record itself remains the anchor amid shifting interpretation.
As attention broadened beyond individual filings and media reaction, references to industry institutions and professional entities began to surface more clearly. These references did not introduce new issues into the case. Instead, they provided context for where certain materials originated and how they were handled within established professional frameworks. Organizations such as Sony and WME appear in the record through their connection to contractual relationships and representation structures tied to the parties involved. Their names surface in filings because documents often include correspondence, agreements, or attribution details that reflect how projects and professional roles are organized. This is standard in disputes that intersect with the entertainment industry. Wayfarer Studios appears in a similar capacity. References to the studio are tied to how materials were grouped and cited within filings, rather than to separate procedural actions. These mentions help clarify the backdrop against which certain communications occurred, but they do not change how the court evaluates the materials themselves. Several individual names also appear in this context, including Alex Sachs, Ange Gianetti, Jamie Heath, and Michael Gottlieb. Their inclusion reflects professional involvement referenced within documents, such as production oversight, legal representation, or correspondence attached to filings. As with institutional names, their presence helps map relationships within the record without expanding the scope of the case. Coverage has sometimes characterized the inclusion of these industry names as evidence of broader misconduct or reputational harm. Those characterizations reflect interpretation rather than procedural findings. From the court's perspective, the relevance of these names is limited to how they appear within documents already on file and how those documents support arguments being made. Understanding this industry context helps explain why attention expanded outward once materials were reviewed together. As more names become visible within the same set of filings, discussion naturally widens.
That widening can feel dramatic, even though the procedural core remains unchanged. At this stage, the record contains a mix of testimony, filings, and contextual references. What has not changed is the structure governing how those materials are considered. With that context in place, the final step is to return to the record itself and summarize what the sequence shows without layering interpretation on top of process.
At this point, the sequence becomes clear when viewed through the court record itself. The materials discussed throughout this video did not emerge all at once, nor did they alter the structure of the case at the moment they became easier to review. They moved through a defined legal process, entering the record through filings, testimony, and motions before access later changed. By following that order, it becomes possible to separate procedure from reaction. Text messages, documents, and references were preserved and grouped over time. When visibility expanded, discussion followed, but the underlying posture of the lawsuit remained grounded in what had already been submitted. Much of the attention surrounding Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Justin Baldoni reflects how familiar names stand out once materials are reviewed together. That visibility can feel dramatic, especially when coverage emphasizes interpretation. The record itself, however, reflects continuity rather than escalation. This breakdown focused on structure and sequence rather than conclusions. By tracing how materials entered the court system, how they were organized, and how access shifted, it becomes easier to understand why attention increased without assuming outcomes or intent. If this kind of step-by-step breakdown is useful, you can like the video or subscribe for future updates.